好了，咱上面声多啊。
Oh, you can all hear me, right? Please raise your hands if you can hear me.
That's a
little bit, got it a bit wrong before. The chapter on vast intelligence can be found in Tibetan. I just saw it. And what can't be found is the characteristics of no characteristics. That chapter. And the chapter on the characteristics of all phenomena. So those two chapters have different chapters than the chapters in Tibetan. So that's an area that needs some research. So what I'd like to speak next is this. And the Sutra of the Array of the Tathagata's Qualities. And we don't know what this is called in Sanskrit, nor is it known when it appeared. And likewise, there's no Sanskrit manuscript. It was not translated into either Sanskrit or into Chinese or Tibetan. The way we know of the existence of this sutra is because it is, as I mentioned, there's the treatise Proving Awareness Only that is translated by Xuanzang. Now, there are quotations of this sutra in that treatise. But other than that, so it mentions that there is the Sutra of the Array of the Tathagata's Qualities. It is not present in either the Chinese or the Tibetan canons, and there's no Sanskrit manuscript, so it's really extremely difficult for us to say actually what it teaches. But if we look at the title of the sutra, then there is a chapter in the Avatamsaka Sutra called the chapter on the origin of the Tathagatas. Actually, the Tibetan translate is probably the teaching on the ocean, the names of the Tathagata's Kayas. It's the same, probably. So we can see that it's probably related to that chapter, because if we look at the title, then it seems very similar to this chapter on the origin of the Tathagatas. But it's difficult to say this definitively. Now, the fourth sutra is the Sutra of Mahayana Abhidharma. Now, this, we don't know the Sanskrit name for it. We don't know its origin. There is no Sanskrit manuscript. And there also are neither Chinese nor Tibetan translations. And so to actually know what it says is very difficult. But there are fragments of it that are cited in many other Indian treatises. And when you look at these citations, we can understand that this is actually an extremely important sutra. And some people also said that this must have been well known before a Sangha. And so this is how it must have been, because so now what some scholars say is that when a Sangha wrote his compendium of the Mahayana, what he took as his basis was the Sutra of Mahayana Abhidharma. Since we can't read the sutra itself, that we cannot read the sutra. And what we do have now are just a few passages that are cited in other treatises. So nothing else of the sutra remains. So it's difficult to say what the thought of the entire sutra is. So there are 12 different passages from the Sutra of the Mahayana Abhidharma that are quoted in the Indian treatises. And if we think about it in terms of the number of citations, the first most well-known is the one that reads, "In the expanse of beginningless time is the basis of all phenomena. Because it exists, all transmigrations and nirvana can be achieved." And so this is a very important passage. It is cited in many Indian texts, including those that are included in the Tibetan canon. It's not only important for the mind only, it's also important for the Buddha nature school. The second is the consciousness with all the seeds of all phenomena is the all ground. Thus I have taught to the noble beings the all ground consciousness. And so this is a passage that teaches the ground consciousness. All phenomena are linked to consciousness and they to it. The things that are results and things that are causes are always mutually linked. Now, what's this here? Please wait a moment. This is really a bit difficult. So it says here, all phenomena are linked to consciousness and deity. Things that are mutually cause and result are always linked to each other. Now, when you look at these three passages, in the Sutra on the Arrival of the the interdependence of the ground consciousness is not clearly taught in the Sutra of Raveling the Intent, but it is clearly taught in this sutra, in particular from this last passage. Things that are mutually cause and result are always looked to each other. So this is talking about the interdependence, the relation of interdependence within the ground consciousness, and that it teaches it very clearly. Now, as I mentioned before, the first passage is even within the text of the Buddha nature school, including the Sublime Continuum, it is extremely important citation for that school too. That's something we all need to understand. Now, the fifth sutra is the Sutra of the Travels to Lanka. Now, the time when this appeared was probably around the 5th or 6th century. This is the estimate. There is Sanskrit manuscript. And in terms of Chinese translations, there's one by Dharmachema of the Northern Way. It's in 10 fascicles, one in 7 fascicles, translated by Tang Shikshananda. So the translation by Tang Shikshananda. And then there is a translation by the Gunabhadra of the Sung dynasty in 4 fascicles. In Tibetan translations, are the Travels to Lanka Sutra. Now, in some catalogs, it's said to be translated from Sanskrit. Some say that it's translated from Chinese, but it's not clear who the translator was. And there are 11 fascicles, 11 bundles or volumes. Then there's the essence of the teachings of all the Buddhas from the Precious Travels to Lanka Sutra. And this is translated by Gochudrup in 8 fascicles. And so these are 2 different versions of the Travels to Lanka Sutra that we have in Tibetan. Now, in terms of its contents, when you're talking about going to Lanka, travels to Lanka, Lanka is what we mean by Sri Lanka these days. That's how we should understand it. Some people say it refers to the island of Sri Lanka, and some people say it refers to a city there. So there are different explanations. So then traveling to Sankara, that means that the Buddha traveled to Lanka and taught the sutra there. So for that reason, it's called the Travels to Lanka. Now, in this sutra, it primarily teaches the thought of the mind only. And it's like a work that combines all the earlier mind-only philosophy into one. But when you look at the sutra, it's like, like an order, a structure. It doesn't have like an organized structure, so it's of a formal nature. And the reason for that is that so there's not a whole lot of structure to it. Everything's just said in the order it comes. So next I'd like to talk about 3 distinctive features of the sutra. So to speak about these characteristics, among the one distinction is that the primary topic of the sutra is the 5 dharmas, 3 characteristics, the 8 consciousnesses, the 2 types of selflessnesses. And so these become the primary topic of the sutra. In particular, what it speaks about is the assertions of the 8th consciousness, the ground consciousness, and the Buddha nature. And it clearly says that these 2 are the same. So it's a feature of the sutra that it teaches that the ground consciousness is Buddha nature, or the all ground is Buddha nature. Now, likewise, what it teaches is that there are no external entities, and that all appearances of external objects just appear because of emphasizes. As it says, no external exists the way that fools imagine they do. The mind disturbed by imprints arises, appearing as emptiness. And this passage is quoted frequently in many Sanskrit treatises. It's teaching the way it says that all phenomena are appearances is a little bit different, but it says that there are appearances, that the external appearances arise from the power of imprints. And in this way, they're mere awareness. And this is a way that explaining that everything is awareness only. Now, since no appearances are no more than a mere appearances to mind, then it's very important to abandon our attachment to external objects. And so it emphasizes how to abandon that attachment. Now, this teaches, instead of teaching about the view of awareness, it teaches primarily talks about the methods of practice, how to eliminate attachment. And so it's speaking more about the methods of practice and meditation. Likewise, the philosophical basis for the sutra is really influenced by the middle way. There are many discussions of that, but I don't need to speak about this in detail today. Another feature is that the sutra speaks about the eight sutras consciousness very, very clearly. Some sutras take about individual ones. They take about them separately. They don't take them as a single, present them in a single thing and explain them clearly. It's very rare to see that in the sutras. And so this travels to Lanka Sutra, the eight consciousnesses are taught extremely clearly. So, in brief, to wrap it up, the Go Travels to Lanka teaches that the view of the awareness only, that all phenomena are awareness only. But in terms of its content, when it's teaching that in terms of the actual, it doesn't have much of an organization or a structure. Because if we look at the Sanskrit manuscripts, the syntax and the style are very different than other sutras. It's really a very particular style. And for many other reasons, the people who compiled the sutra, the people who compiled and put the sutra together, were like, seems like they're people are compiling the sources of the mind only. Speaking a little bit about this mind only view, a little bit about the middle way, little bit of the mind only, a little about a mind only. So it's compiled by several people who is like, some people think, researchers say that this could be what it is. Now, as I said before, there is a Sanskrit manuscript for this that travels to Lanka. And when we look at this, it doesn't really seem that it all appeared at a single time. Some things were written earlier, some written later, as it seems very many different forms. But the basis for this, like the kernel of the travels to Lanka, the period of time that appeared, it comes from somewhere around the 3rd century. But later, it seems like many things are added to this. And it seems to come to its present form that we can see now in around the 4th century. Now, another point, there are no quotations from the Travels to Lanka Sutra in the works of Vasubandu. And so when we see this, we see that the Travels to Lanka Sutra probably was after Vasubandhu, not before that. So there's that doubt. But these days, there's one position is that Vasubandhu lived in the 5th century. It's a very strong position. So if that is the case, then there's support for the idea that the sutra precedes or predates Vasubandhu. At any rate, there is there are no citations of the sutra in the works of Vasubandhu. Now for the 6th sutra, this is the Ganavyuha Sutra. The Ganavyuha Sutra appeared in the 5th century. This is the estimate. There is no Sanskrit manuscript now that so it was translated into Chinese by Divakara and by Amoghavadra. So there are 2 different translations in the Chinese. In Tibetan, there is a Tibetan translation with 4 fascicles, 4 volumes, but the translator is not mentioned. So it seems that there is a bit of it is missing, that whether they didn't have the Sanskrit manuscript or whether there were parts of it were lost, it's not clear. Now, the school of phenomenal appearances assumes that the sutra was an important support basis for the mind-only view. Now, when later modern researchers examined this, it wasn't only considered important by the school of phenomenal appearances. In Tibetan, we have a commentary on the Yogacara levels. It's it's a Sanskrit text that's translated to Tibetan. And this gives citations from the Ganavyuha Sutra. So we can see that even before in India, the Ganavyuha Sutra is considered very important. But these days, there are very few people who are researching the Ganavyuha Sutra. So we can hope that in the future, if there are many new researches, then we can have some new results or new conclusions about this Ganavyuha Sutra. So this is what it said. Now, within the sutra, in terms of content, it teaches that the ground consciousness is the Ganavyuha Sutra. So it's saying that it's the Ganavyuha is the name of a Buddha realm, and so they're saying that this all ground consciousness is this pure realm. And it also teaches the 5 dharmas and 3 characteristics and so forth to show that they all are ground consciousness is the basis of samsara nirvana. And so I think that this Ganavyuha Sutra is one that we need to pay some attention to. So I've not spoken about the 6 sutras. So next, there are the 11 treatises. We need to give an introduction to those. And we don't have time today to go through all 11 of these sutras. So today I'll give through just a few of these, and then the rest of them I will, I hope I can give an introduction to the rest of them next year. So generally, we talk about the school of phenomenal appearances in China and talk about the supporting scriptures, the supporting sutras and treatises. And we have, in terms of sutras, there are 6 sutras. And among the 6 sutras, the one that is most opinion is the Sutra Unraveling the Intent. Of the 11 intents, of the 11 treatises, the most important of them is the Yogacara levels. And the meaning of these, if we talk about compiling into one work or completing, giving a commentary on the meanings of all the sutras and treatises, it's a very important sutra that does this. And so now what shows in Chinese there is the treatise proving the mind only. Now this is written by Dharmapala and translated into Chinese by Xuanzang. We don't have it in Chinese. Now before you study this text, you'd have like the beginnings. Like for example, like when you study the Prajnaparamita, you have so many ancillary subjects. And similarly, when you're studying this, and the Chinese they have the text by Vasubandu called the 100 Gates to the Dharma, which talks about the different lists of mantras. It talks about the 5 bases of appearances. Now, and when you discuss this when you speak about this in terms of the treasure of Abhidharma, they speak about this in terms of 75 different types of dharmas, but in the mind only, in the Mahayana or mind only, we talk about the 100 different types of dharma that are determined. And since this is like an important step for the initial stages of study of the mind only, and another primary introductory text for the School of Phenomenal Appearances is a text by Xuanzang called "Delineating the 8 Consciousnesses." Now, I've translated this into Tibetan, but I'm not like 100% satisfied with it. But in the future, perhaps, if I can get a nice translation in the next year and maybe show it to you on the future. Anyways, these 2 sutras are like the 2 introductory texts. And so I thought I should mention this. So next among the 11 treatises, there is the Yogacara levels. The Yogacara levels is said in the Chinese situation, is said to be written by Maitreya, and in the Tibetan tradition, we say it's written by Asanga. But some Tibetan scholars say, so Chandra says, it was taught by Maitreya, and the Asanga took notes. So even in Tibet, we say that there are people who say that it was written by Maitreya. Now, in the Chinese translation is the treatise called the Yogacara Levels, translated by Tang Xuanzang. This is 100 fascicles. It's very large. It's very complete. Otherwise, if we think of it, there are many other translations of the sections from it, like the Bodhisattva Levels. There are many other translations, but the complete translation was by Tang Xuanzang. Now, in Tibetan, the Yogacara Levels was translated by translator Yeshide, and it's in 130 fascicles. It was translated during the ancient translation period. Note its distinctive feature is in terms of its primary topic, where its feature is the teaching the stages of experience of those practices of the meditators of the Yogacara. It teaches the 7 different stages of the practice or of experience that they have, the stages of their paths and levels. Likewise, this Yogacara Levels is like the earliest organized and structured text that teaches the mind-only philosophy. Since this text is 100 fascicles long, so it is a very long text, right? And when you look at these texts, what they said in the ancient times is called the long commentary on all the sutras. And just as they're called this in the ancient times, if we look at, because it condenses the essence of the thought of many sutras that all appeared earlier. It gathers them all into one and compiles them all. And so for that reason, it is called a compendium of all Buddhist knowledge. It has the teachings of the foundation and greater Mahayana vehicles, the teachings for the Shravakas and the Bodhisattvas. So basically, it's a compendium, a Buddhist encyclopedia. Likewise, when you're thinking about the connection between this text and the mind-only philosophy, from the fascicle 75 to 78, these fascicles or volumes all quote all of they collect the entire sutra intent except for the introduction. Otherwise, it quotes the entire text. And not only, and if we look at just this, we can see how much of an influence the sutra unraveling the intent must have had on it. There's no need to mention it. It's very obvious. Likewise, when we think about the Yogacara Levels, the most important sections are the main part on the levels and the compendium of Arstanians. Now, these are the main part of the levels and the compendium of the asanas. If we compare these two, if we do a comparative research into them, the part of the main part does not really give much of a structured presentation of the philosophy of the all ground. And it doesn't even use the terms, 3 characters in the 3 lives of nature. Now, but in the compendium of awareness, with a certain degree of structure, there's a discussion of the presentation of the mind, of the ground consciousness. And the way it explains it as we go through this, it teaches in terms of the 8 reasons for the existence of the all ground. And it also talks about the 8 reasons for how appearances arise from the all ground. And then in the end, how appearances then disappear into the ground consciousness. So it talks about the nature of the ground consciousness and the functions of the ground consciousness. It examines these in detail. So for that reason, this presentation of the all ground consciousness is very clear in the Yogacara Levels, and so it's because was the beginning of the presentation of the all ground that becoming clearer and more developed. So that began with the with the section of the Yogacara levels, the compendium of ascertainments. Likewise, the Yogacara levels also had a very strong influence on later masters. And another thing we need to pay attention to is when we talk about the three characteristics of the three laws of nature. Now, these are taught in the Sutra Unraveling the Intent. But later, there hadn't been much development of the thought in terms of the three characteristics and the three laws of nature. There hadn't been much development in this area after the Sutra of Unraveling the Intent. But within the Yogacara levels, the ground consciousness is explained in a fairly structured and organized ways, and then later, mind-only masters would investigate in this presentation of the eight ground conscious, and then that they emphasized that it developed greatly. However, but if we compare to the three characteristics in the three laws of nature, they're just explained as in the unraveling the intent. There is no real development or improvement in the thought. So this sort of seems as if there's hadn't been much development in that area. Now, the second treatise is the ornament of the Mahayana Sutras. Now, the ornament of the sutras, you can say there's verses and prose. Now, the verses are the text and the prose is a commentary. Now, the Chinese consider both of these to be equal in tenets. Now, so that's in the Chinese tradition. They consider to be equal importance. Now, in the Chinese tradition, the verses and prose are considered equal importance, and there are so many. And so these days, many people talk about it in terms of the verses and prose. In any case, the verses were by Maitreya and the prose is by Vasubandu. And there is a Sanskrit title. And the Chinese translation is in 13 fascicles translated by Prabhakaramita. And in Tibetan, we have a 3-fascicle version translated by Paltsek, and then also an explanation of the ornamented sutras by Vasubandu that's translated by Pascal. It's also in 3 fascicles. Now, if we look at it in terms of its content, the title is, it says, the sutra, the ornament in the title is the Sanskrit word alankara. And this means like a Tibetan type of style of poetic composition. And so this is one type of verse is called alankara. Now, the reason it's called an alankara because through the poetic methods of the style of the Alankara poetry is written, and it explains Mahayana through this style, so it's a particular distinguishing feature of it. And also the words are very follow the poetic structure, and so for this reason they have very this is something that you would understand only if you can look at the Sanskrit manuscript. You wouldn't know that. So it's a very poetic form. Now, translating poetry from another language is extremely different. If you can translate 50%, that's fine. If you can get the meaning, but to get the feeling and to get the poetry of it into another language, because the way the language works is completely different. You've got really beautiful poetry in Chinese, and you translate it into Tibetan. It's like no point to it. And if you make it into something that has its own poetic, Tibetan sort of poetic translation, it's a different matter. But if you translate the meaning literally, then you're just translating the meaning, but translating the word literally, you can't do this. So translating the poetry perfectly into another language is just something you can't do. And likewise, in this, you talked about different forms, and so they use different very analogies. And it's got a really particular feeling because you've got the words are really beautiful, very poetic words. The meaning, when you look at the words, are using very different analogies, and so people get a really particular feeling from it. This is this distinctive feature of this text. Now, as I mentioned before, when you talk about the ornament of the sutras, these days the researchers talk about the verse and the prose. And if we put the two together, then we say then only when you put the two together can you get the complete meaning of the ornament of the sutras. For example, if you study the sublime continuum, for us we have a problem with the verses. But if you look at the when you look at it, so many of the words that are in our rhythm. So many of the words that we have in commentaries that are in Tibetan are actually part of the are actually in the root text in the Chinese and Sanskrit. So we think they say that actually basically so when you look at this in terms of the ornament of the sutra, it's said in China that with the ornament of the sutras that the verses were written by Asanga and the text by Vasubandu. And there are different positions on this. Now within this text, there are 21 different sections. Now, of course, there are different ways to divide it into sections, but there are 21 different sections and some 800 stanzas. Now, the basic framework of this text is there's the bodhisattva levels from the Yogacara levels, right? So it's the same as the bodhisattva levels. They've taken the framework of the bodhisattva levels, taken the framework and the way of doing things, and it's written based on that. But in terms of the view, there had been a great development. So it shows that the great improvement and great development in terms of the view. So one representative example is we've got the presentation of the apprehended object and apprehended mind, a presentation of incorrect conceptualization, then mindset and appearances and non-appearance. And so there are many new terms, many new presentations. So there's when you say that there's no external object, the external entities do not exist, and then all phenomena are merely mind. It's giving a new explanation of these and a different explanation of them. But within the ornament of the sutras, the ground consciousness and the other characters are not particularly given a structured explanation. So what we can tell from this is that this ornament of the sutras, if we think about it in terms of the Tibetan, it is written by Maitreya. So that among the 5 works of Maitreya, it's the earliest, and because the later works give structured explanations of the ground consciousness and the 3 characteristics. And so if you think about it in terms of the development and the changes, then that is how it would be. Now, in terms of Tibetan, there are commentaries by Asvabhava and Stiramata. The commentary by Asvabhava is like a summary of it. And if you compare it to its Stiramata's commentary, it's more detailed. So it's very useful in the research of the ornament of the sutras. The third text is the differentiating the middle from extremes. Now, this differentiating middle from extremes, there are also verses in prose. In the Chinese translation, if we talk about the prose and verse, in our Tibetan way of speaking, we talk about the verses just being the verse, and the prose or the commentary. But in the Chinese, there is a 2 version by Yi Jing, and then a 3 fascicle version by Xuanzang. In terms of Tibetan, there's the 700 or the 70 the 70 verse translation of the 70 verse translation of the poetry by Maitreya, and then the commentary, a separate translation of the commentary by Vasubandu. It's translated by the Lotso Yeshide and others. In terms of its content, the text has 5 sections, and it has probably about 110 stanzas. We have there's a Sanskrit manuscript for this text, the differentiating middle from extremes. It was compiled by a Japanese scholar and is very beneficial for research. And now what it's teaching, now the word itself, the title of the text has talked about differentiating middle from extremes. So middle in the center, and then the extremes talking about the falling to a bias. So it primarily touches the middle way that discards extremes of emptiness and a non-existence, or the topic of emptiness. And so for this reading, one of its particular features is that it teaches the meaning of the middle way in terms of mind-only philosophy. This is a real feature. So the meaning of the middle way what it says at the very beginning about this, at the beginning, is there is incorrect conceptualization. The two do not exist in that. Emptiness exists in this, in that as well there is this. And this is what it says. When you're saying there's incorrect conceptual vision, so there is this incorrect conceptualization, and because of that, there are the apprehender and the apprehended. Because of in-concept composition, there is the apprehender and apprehended. Within the expanse of emptiness, this meaning that is emptiness and not emptiness as well, the incorrect conceptuals and the emptiness have this aspects that are empty and that are not empty, and so they're not complete blank void. Because there's neither apprehended object nor apprehended mind that exists in option is also not empty. And so this is how they describe what is meant by the words of middle way. This is a little bit of a different way of explaining the meaning of middle way as opposed to how described in the middle way school. So the framework of this text is that it's primarily about conceptualization, like the apprehended object and apprehending mind. But the differentiating of middle from extremes is a more organized nature. It's more structured than the ornament of this sutra. So we can infer that in terms of its date, it must have been later than the ornament of the sutras. Likewise, unlike the ornament of the sutras, the differentiating of the middle from extremes has like more of a form of a commentary. Like in a commentary, when you have like a root and a commentary, it's more like a commentarial text. It's easier to understand. The way it explains things is very simple and easy to understand, and explains things in detail. The ornament of the sutras does not give as detailed explanations as to differentiate the middle from extremes. Likewise, if you look at the view, that it's given in a structured form. This is another particular feature. I don't need to speak too much about this now. The next is the Compendium of Abhidharma, the fourth treatise. This is the third or the fourth. Did I go through? Oh yeah, there was one there. Oh no, I've got two-third treatises in my presentation.
오호호호호. 아니, 내가 잘못입니다.
It's not working right.
뭐야? 다等于西伯的我们估计下的，但我
Now,
们
the fourth treatise is the Compendium of Abhidharma. Now, this was written by Asanga, and there's no complete Sanskrit manuscript of the text, but there are many passages quoted in other texts, and if we combine them all, as many as we can, so they've put them all together, but if you talk about in terms of the percentage of the text, it's probably about 40% of it. The entire Sanskrit manuscript has not been put together. It's just reconstructed. In the Chinese, there's a 7 fascicle translation by Xuanzang, and then the translation by Yeshide in 5. And the Xuanzang translation adds the word Mahayana to it. In the Tibetan translation, it just says Compendium of Abhidharma. It doesn't specify Mahayana. But the Tang Xuanzang translation adds the word Mahayana. And the reason for this is in order to differentiate this from the foundation vehicle Abhidharma. So we can probably add it by the translator Tang Xuanzang himself. Now the text has 5 sections. So it's 5 parts. Now, the Tang Xuanzang divides the first section into different sections, so it's a total of 8. But the main topic in general so like in the earlier Abhidharma, there are many different summaries and terminology, and so it then comments them and explains them all in a way that accords with the positions of the Yogacara school. Now, there are 2 commentaries on the ornament of the on the Compendium of Abhidharma. One by Jinamitra called the Explanation of Abhidharma, and another one also by Jinamitra that's called the Commentary on the Compendium of Abhidharma. Both were translated by Yeshide. In Chinese, it said that the text that they're compiled by Stiramata. And this was translated by Tang Xuanzang. Now, I don't need to say too much about that. So after that, the next is the 5th is the Compendium of the Mahayana. Now, this is a very important text. The author is Asanga, and there's no Sanskrit manuscript. And there are 3 different translations into Chinese. And in Tibetan, it was translated by Yeshide. It's in 4 fascicles. In terms of its content, it's different than the other text by Asanga. Not only is it related to the mind only, but it's also considered a very important mind-only text. Now, one reason why it's such an important text is that there's a paramata, right? Because of the Paramata's translation, the Compendium of the Abhidharma, there is developed a compendium school in China. So what that really traces back to is this Compendium of Mahayana, right? So this gives us an idea of how important the text was and how much of an influence, even just knowing that amount of history, you can understand this. Now, Tibetan scholars, including Bhutan Rinpoche, say that the Compendium of the Abhidharma is like a compiles the essence of all phenomena. And this trend is like compiles the meaning of the Mahayana. And so in this way, it's like the summary of these two texts together are both called the two summaries. Now, if we think about the origins of this, because this text explains all the stages of levels are explained very clearly. It is probably a very early mind-only text. At the beginning of this text, it speaks about how talks about how the first two talk the basis to be known in Mahayana practice, what we need to know, how the Mahayana is the words of the Buddha, and it describes what are the different aspects of the Mahayana practice. And generally, in this text has 10 different sections. The first is the all ground, the second. Then there's the three characters, the three lacks of notions, 10 different sections. I don't need to mention them all. And sort of among these 10 different sections, what the first section talks about is the first part talks about the all ground and the three characters. And to talk about the all ground and this is talking about the things that the basis for knowledge of the Mahayana practice. The third to the eighth section talks about the conduct of Mahayana practice. Then the ninth and 10th talk about the fruition, the result of the Mahayana practice. So in brief, through these 10 sections, there's a complete and organized explanation and summary of the Mahayana. In particular, in the Mahayana, compared to the Mahayana, it talks about the relation between the all ground and the three characteristics. It speaks about these extremely clearly. And that relationship between the all ground and the three characteristics and how they are identified is not really described in the text of Maitreya, such as the ornament of the sutras and the differentiating the middle of its extremes. And so that's one reason why the compendium of the Mahayana is particularly important. Some brief. The main reason why the Compendium Mahayana is an important mind-only text is that it probably takes all of the mind-only views taught in earlier sutras and treatises and it combines them in an organized and structured way. As it talks about the three characteristics of the characteristics, its specific characters, its causal characters, its resultant characters, and it identifies its characteristics clearly. It clearly identifies the meaning of the seeds and the meanings of four meanings of imprints and so forth. And so in this way, so particularly it gives a really, the presentations of the seeds and imprints find a really strong foundation in this text, the compendium of the Mahayana. So to sum it up, this compendium of Mahayana not only clearly identifies the characteristics of the ground consciousness, it also takes the interdependence of the ground consciousness and how the imprints occur, how the other consciousnesses put imprints in the ground consciousness. And so it talks about the interdependence of the ground consciousness and he uses that to prove the essence of the mind-only philosophy, that all phenomena are mind-only. And so this is a distinguished feature of the Compendium of Mahayana. It is the most important of the texts written by Asanga. Now, in terms of commentaries, there's one by Vasubandu that's translated into Tibetan. There are also one by Vasubandu that's translated by Yeshide. In Chinese, Vasubandu's commentary was translated by Paramartha and also by Dharmagarba in the Swede, and also by Tang Xuan Song. So there are three different translations. The one by Vasubandu is also translated by Tang Xuan Song. So both of these commentaries by Vasubandu and Vasubandu are in both Chinese and in Tibetan. There's also another translation in Tibetan. It's not clear who it was written by. So there's another translation, but this translation, but it only speaks about half of the first section. The rest doesn't, the section talking about the ground consciousness, it doesn't speak about anymore. Now, the sixth section is the treatise clarifying the teachings of the treatise elucidating the words of the nobles. And it's said to be written by a Sangha. Some say it's written by Vasubandu. There's no Sanskrit manuscript. And there is Tang Xuan Sang's Chinese translation into Chinese. Now, in Tibetan, it was not translated into Tibetan. The main point is this. It takes all the points from the Yogacara levels. Oh, there's a typo there.
Oh yeah. 他等于的是牛多路下来，你看到的。
And today there's a danger that it's going to get a little bit boring today.
Oh yeah. So the
Yogacara levels, right? So it takes the points from the Yogacara list and it explains them clearly. And so for that reason, so if we want to know what the connection between Yogacara levels and Asanga, this is a very important text in terms of researching that question. Now, last thing I'd like to explain today is this. I can't talk about all of the 11 treatises, but the last one I want to speak about is the 30. Because we're talking about a teaching on the 30s, and I haven't even talked about a single verse from the 30 verses. So I need to give at least an introduction of the 30 verses, or it wouldn't be okay. So I'm going to give an introduction to the 30 verses. The verses on the 30 verses, it says. It's translated by Lotsaw Yeshide. Now, the Chinese translation was the Tang Xuan Sang. The Tibetan translation was by Lotsaw Yeshide. Now, the main feature of this, if you speak about it, now the 30 verses, so the mind-only 30 verses, is a late work of Vasubandu's. After he had finished writing this work, he didn't have enough time, he didn't live long enough to write a commentary on it. And so if you look at it then we can see that like the final result of Vasubandu's lifetime of work investigating philosophy. And if you could also say it's like the most complete presentation of philosophy, it's okay to say that too. Generally, we have both the 20 verses and the 30 verses were written by Vasubandu. Now, in the Chinese, and both for the 20 verses and the 30 verses, they add the term mind-only to it. The 20 mind-only verses, the 30 mind-only verses. And so they add the words of mind only to it. But these words mind only are missing from the Tibetan titles. It's called the 20 verses and the 30 verses. There's no word mind only. But I think if we added it, it would be good. And the reason why it would be good is if otherwise, when we say the 30 verses, then immediately what we think about is the 30 verses, the grammar text. And so there's a danger that will confuse the mind only 30 verses for the grammar 30 verses. Likewise, the 20 verses primarily refutes other traditions. It translates the assertions of non-Buddhist Orthodox Hindu schools and Buddhist Kriya schools who assert that there are objects that are other than the mind. So it's written to refute them, to disprove the prefaces. And likewise, it is also to, when we say that all phenomena are only mind, there are doubts and questions that arise. And so it's written in order to dispel those doubts and questions. So it's primarily to refute other traditions. Now, the 30 verses, in the 30 verses, all the natures and presentations related to mind only are taught in an ordered and organized fashion. So it gives a structure to the thought that proves the mind awareness only. It puts it in order, it gives it a structure. It is a very clear presentation. Now, the 30 verses is, of course, only 30 stanzas long. And since it's only 30 stanzas, it's very short, but its meaning is complete. So it teaches the essence, the forms, of the result, of the aspect, the essence of the path. So basically, it formulates all the stages of the mind only in a very structured and ordered fashion. Now, for this reason, the Indian scholars of that time, later scholars, and modern researchers have said that, like when you're researching, they're investigating the mind only. The indispensable text is these 30 verses. If you talk about it, there are three main topics, or three main sections. So Xuanzang says that there are three main sections. So I'd like to give an introduction to them. Now, what these three main sections are is, the first of this is to explain the form of the mind only. The second explains the nature of the mind only. The third explains the result of the mind only. So these are the three main sections. Now, from the first stanza of the 30 stanzas until the 24th, what they teach primarily is they talk about the form of the mind only. And that's the main topic. And then the 25th stanza teaches like the nature of the mind only. That's what it teaches. Then the stanzas 26 to 30 primarily teach the result of mind only. Now, when you divide to look at the first main section, this actually has three different parts. Now, the first part of this first subsection talks about the fears of the features and the function and essence of the three types of change. So these are the eighth consciousness, the afflicted mind, and the six consciousnesses. So it teaches their features. It talks about the eight of these. It talks about what are their features, what are their functions, what are they? It teaches these all very clearly. Then the second subsection teaches rebuts the primary doubts about the mind only system. When you say that all phenomena are mind, there are these difficulties, there are these doubts and questions that come up. It talks about the primary questions and the primary doubts, and it dispels them. Now, the third section discusses the relation between the three natures and the three lacks of nature. You've talked about the three natures, the three characteristics. So some of the three essences and the three lacks of essence. But in brief, we're talking about the three natures of the imaginary, dependent, and absolute, and the three lacks of nature. how the imaginary and so forth lack nature, and so these three lacks of nature, and it speaks about the relation between these two. Now, the second main section and third, what they speak about is speaks about the nature of the mind only. The nature that it sort of determines and summarizes this idea that all phenomena are mind only. Sort of wraps this up in it, and it teaches that, and it emphasizes that they're all mind only. So it resolves all this, it sums them up, and it teaches how all phenomena are mind only. There are no external entities, there are no external objects, nothing transcends the nature of mind, and it emphasizes this. Now, the main section primarily teaches the result of the mind only. What it teaches is how, once you develop the correct mind only view in your mind, then how is it that based on that you progress through the 5 levels and the 5 paths and 10 levels to reach Buddhahood? So, in brief, these 30 verses are like the pinnacle of all of Vasubandu's works, the greatest of his works. It's like the first place among all his works. So now I'd like to speak of like a few of the reasons why this work is so extremely important. Now, the first of these is that there's nothing to particularly choose, so I might as well close that. Now, the first reason why it is so important that it explains in detail what the relations among the 8 consciousnesses are. Now, before the 30th section, it was not really clearly taught what the function of the 7th consciousness of what the affected mind, or what its nature is. In different texts, there were different positions. There was no consensus among them. Some of them said that the afflicted mind was a conceptual isolate of the 8th consciousnesses. They did speak about it as an independent or separate consciousness. Another scholar said that the afflicted mind was an independent consciousness, is a different consciousness than the 8th consciousness. Now, after the 30 verses had been written, then everyone had a consensus, because in the 30 verses, it describes how the afflicted mind is an independent consciousness that is separate from the ground consciousness. It identifies this clearly and explains the reasons for this clearly. So for this reason, the earlier situation where there was no consensus and no clarity about the nature of the 7th consciousness was rectified. Now, another thing is that it unifies the 3 types of change. It's like a single essence. Before the 3 verses, you talk about the 3 types of change, the 3 types of change of consciousness. As it says at the beginning, it says our changes in consciousness in the very first stanza. Something about how the change of consciousness, how because the mind changes and how does it work? How does it change? And so that talks about the way that it does it. When we talk about there are many different opinions and contradictory opinions about how the changes of consciousness before the 30 verses appeared. Some traditions during the time of the 18th schools, there's a subtle consciousness, a single continuum of subtle consciousness, and because of the subtle consciousness, that all phenomena could arise. So there's this presentation from the earlier period of the schools, and so later, other schools took this position of the essence of this presentation of the single type of essence and used it. Now, another presentation didn't really clearly identify it. like they're not clear, but they accepted the three types of change. But it's not as clear as this, but there's a sort of a form of that. Now, in the 30 verses, what it teaches when you say the three kinds of change, what it is the ground, the afflicted mind, and the eight engaging, six engaging consciousness. These are very clearly identified. And so there's in the previous, and sort of in the earlier position, you have they say that there's a one consciousness. And if you say that, then there's a danger of becoming an assertion of mind that is like an independent, autonomous mind that is like the creator of everything, or it's like a soul or self as posited by the external natures. So he changed the idea that everything was just changes in one consciousness, and he created the presentation, the interdependence of the ground consciousness. And because if you say that the ground consciousness alone, if there's only the ground consciousness and no other consciousnesses, then you have that all consciousness is one. So there's a second. You see, the first type of change is the ground consciousness. The second type of change is the egoism or afflicted mind, and the other six consciousnesses are the six consciousnesses. And so, instead of saying that instead of having a single autonomous ground consciousness that does everything, you've got different consciousnesses that have different functions. So for that reason, it's a very good presentation of the ground consciousness, a very fitting and very appropriate attention. Now, the third feature is that so it talks about the relation between the dependent and the immaterial natures. It explains in great detail what the relation between the dependent and the immaterial natures. In the 30 verses, it's taught that without stopping the grasping at the imaginary, yogis are unable to realize the actual meaning of the dependent. So you've got dividing the apprehending part and the apprehended part, and dividing the focus and the aspects, and dividing it into two different parts. You've got the cognitive image and the apprehending aspect, and dividing these two, right? And because of this, then it exhibits the understanding of the true image mind-only school. And so because of this text of the 30 verses, it gets this presentation. So later we talk about the true image and the five image schools. And so the field from which these could grow was the 30 verses, because it divides the apprehended and apprehended different and treats them differently. And so for that reason, you can have the question of the true image or the false image schools. So the question is whether the cognitive image, like the cognitive image of blue that appears to an eye consciousness apprehending blue, this blue image of blue, is it true or is it not? That's that question that we have. Is it real or is it not? Is it confusion or not? And so when you speak about this, then you have the reason why the place where the difference in opinion comes from this presentation in the 30 verses. Likewise, many later mindfulness schools primarily wrote commentaries about the 30 verses. They wrote many commentaries about it. And because they wrote so many commentaries about it, and they had different understandings of the 30 verses, and because of this, the distinction between the true image and the false image schools developed. But the beginning of the true image and the false image schools traces back to the 30 verses. Now, when Vasubandhu himself was living, he didn't have enough time in his life to write a commentary on it. But he had his students, and they're also their students, and the 10 commentators and others who wrote commentaries on it. Now, the reason why there's so many commentaries on it is that after Vasubandhu wrote the 30 verses, then it became like the root text of the mind-only school. And the reason is because, like Vasubandhu, he had really investigated the meaning of mind-only, thought about it and considered it, pondered it. Not only think about it, he investigated it through listening, contemplating, and meditating, and he did a lot of practice on the idea of mind only. And this is the result of that. And after he wrote this, he didn't live very long before he passed to nirvana. And so there's nothing that, so everything that he knew is included in this 30 verses. So that reason is like the root text of the mind only school. And everyone recognizes it like this. And so for the money that you sort of think yourself as a scholar of the mind only school, if you say, if you want to have the conceit that you're a scholar of the mind only, then there's no choice but to recite a commentary on the 30 verses. And if you can give an explanation, that you can say, you can show that you're learned in the mind only. So for that reason, there are a lot of commentaries on the 30 verses. Likewise, even within the mind only, there are many had different positions on how we should prove that everything is awareness only. And so you have the different positions of like the false image and the true image and so forth. Now, when you look at the different commentaries, but as I mentioned, but among them, like the one that are really most important, the exemplary commentaries are the two by Stiramati, that is translated into Tibetan, and the commentary by Dharmapala. Now, the commentary by Dharmapala is the one called the Treatise Proving Mind Awareness Only. Now, if we think about the main difference between their experiences, if we talk, it come down to how they explain the presentations of the 30 verses. They had different ideas of how to explain the 30 verses, and it primarily comes down to the explanation of this. Now, to give an example of this, no, actually, I'm primarily speaking about the aspects of view. To give like an example of this. So Stiramata says that cognition, like, has a knowing apprehending part that knows an object, and then a known apprehended part that of the object. It has these two parts. As that Vasubandu says it, he divides it into the apprehended and the apprehending parts. Once you divide them into two, then you have the apprehender is like the knowing mind, and then you have the known aspect of the known object. It's like when you have an eye consciousness apprehending blue, the cognitive edge of blue is the apprehended aspect. And then you have the part of the apprehending mind, that is the apprehending image. And so he says that this is just a result of the imprints of thought from beginningless time, but in actuality and ultimately, the apprehended and the asserted do not truly exist. And the reason for this is that because the blue does not appear as an existence, but it appears as the cognitive appearance as an appearance of blue. So the appearance is confusion. So the mind that sees it is also confused because they can't exist without each other. So the apprehending part and the asking part does not exist, but there is the mere knowing clear mind, that merely clear knowing mind, and in terms of itself, it actually exists. And so for that reason, he says that it has a single part of cognition. The self-isolate is the dependent nature, and the parts of the apprehended and the apprehender are imaginary. And so when you look at what some scholars say about this, for example, Gunamati and Nanda, what they say, if you have a single consciousness, when a consciousness apprehending blue appears, you've got the apprehending aspect that apprehends the cognitive edge of blue, and the cognitive edge of blue, that is the apprehended part, right? They arise together. They arise simultaneous. Otherwise, then it couldn't be a knowledge of blue or an awareness of blue, because if If they don't arise together, then you have to say that it's a consciousness that doesn't know an object. And so what it says is that they have to say that both the apprehended part and the apprehending part have to be dependent. And so that has the two parts. And so this is what we call the assertion of two parts. And then what Dagnaga said about this is said, you have the two apprehended and the apprehending parts, and they divide the depending aspect into the apprehending aspect into two parts. That has a part of it has that awareness that knows the cognitive image of blue, and that apprehended part. There's a part of it that is looking outward, and there's a part of it that's turning inward and knowing itself. And the part that is looking outside, what that is the sensory awareness of blue, and the part that is looking inside is the self-awareness of that part of asking. It is the self-awareness of the apprehension of blue. So this is a presentation of self-awareness, dividing the cognition into two parts, or the apprehending part into two parts that is directed outward, looking out at the apprehension of blue, and then the self-awareness of that is looking as the cognition that is looking inside. Then during the time of Dharmapala, what he says is the three parts taught about in Dagna, he adds a fourth part. And what that part is, that there's an awareness of that self-awareness. Because you have the apprehending aspect is the valid means, and the result of that is the awareness of the blue, and so then you have to have the self-awareness of the result, and then you the part of something that knows that. So who knows that? So how do you know that you're knowing? Well, it's because you're knowing it because through the awareness of the blue. And you know that you have that because of the self-awareness. So now who knows that there's that awareness? You have you have to present that there's an awareness of the self-awareness. Otherwise, you say that you can't prove that there is any self-awareness that is aware of the awareness of blue. Because so therefore it's a self-awareness. So now if you present that, so if you have that, that awareness of self-awareness, then you have to have an awareness that is aware of the awareness of the self-awareness. So you have to present that. And if you say that, that's not necessary. The reason, because the self-awareness looks inside it, because it's looking inside, and so it knows the awareness of the self-awareness, and so there's no need for a separate fifth part. And so what this all comes down to is in the 30 verses, the Vasubandu divides the apprehender and apprehended into two different parts, defining the apprehending part and the cognitive image into two parts. So when you have the sensory consciousness of blue, the question is the apprehended, the cognitive image, is it true or not? Is it a non-concurrent formation? Is it consciousness? That's a very complicated. Is the cognitive image, cognitive blue and a sensory consciousness of blue, is it consciousness? If you said if it's a non-concurrent conformation, then if it's a part of it's like a part of the mind, since it's the apprehended part. But if it's not actually mind, that's strange. But if you say it's mind, then when you say blue, then it's because you have the cognitive image, but there's no individual blue. There's no blue itself. But you have that cognitive of blue that appears to mind, and you say in the world, when we say blue in society, then that is just that cognitive image of blue, but there's not actually any blue that's an external object. And if that cognitive image of blue is blue, the cognitive is blue, and it's also mind, and that's also considered. For example, it's the cognitive image of a vase. Is that a vase? If it's a cognitive image of a vase, then is that a vase? Then there'd be a common locus between cognition and vases, and so that's a very complicated topic. Maybe I don't need to speak too much about that. In any case, I will be speaking about the philosophy next year. I need to do a lot of study in the next year, particularly the ones that are in Chinese. My hope is that So I can translate the Shuozhang's translation into Tibetan. Now, of course, if I can translate the Chinese text into Tibetan. So we did do a draft translation, but it needs to be edited quite a bit. So I need to translate that. Even if I can't do the whole thing, maybe at least translate the commentary and 10 commentaries. No, there are 10 fascicles, so I think it's probably a full volume. It's got 10 fascicles. So it's probably like one volume, maybe half of a volume of the Tenjur. Now, there are many different commentaries, and there's a commentary by Kueiji. It's probably 5 or 6 volumes, similar to our commentary volumes. So I can't translate that this year. Is it better to decide not? If I say that I'm going to do this, then actually. Otherwise, there's the difficulty. I'm just going to be giving more difficulties to myself. So so that's all for today. So that is enough for the 30 verses video, and we'll continue teaching that next year. So we begin, next we'll have the dedication prayers.
Jai